Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. At The Reason We Learn, we aspire to be part of the solution. The purpose of this show is to take a good, honest, potentially painful look at the way kids are being educated. We know we can do better, and this is where we'll talk about how. Let's learn something. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. If you are new to this channel and interested in being part of the solution to our education crisis, I hope you will subscribe to be notified when I make new content or host shows like this. Please also like and share this broadcast so others can benefit from the information we are about to share. Today's guest is here to talk to us about a subject that you hear a lot about in the news and on social media: standardized testing. People tend to have strong opinions on it one way or the other. Each of these shows is an opportunity to hear from people who are working to improve education in America any way they can, and this one is no exception. Jeremy Tate is the founder and CEO of Classic Learning Test. Jeremy is also the host of the Anchored podcast, CLT's top 2% global podcast that features discussions at the intersection of education and culture. Prior to founding the Classic Learning Test, CLT is also the letters for my hometown of Charlotte. Isn't that interesting? Jeremy served as director of college counseling at Mount DeSales Academy in Cantonsville, Maryland. He received his Bachelor of Science in Secondary Education from Louisiana State University and a Master's in Religious Studies from Reformed Theological Seminary. Jeremy and his wife, Erin, reside in Annapolis, Maryland with their 6 children. And you can find him on Twitter. I'll put his address up at the end of the broadcast. It's at Jeremy Tate 41. So without further ado, let's welcome Jeremy to the program. Hello, how are you today?
Deb, doing great. Thank you for the invite and a huge congrats to you. I mean, you've really kind of galvanized this conversation nationally. I'm just hearing quite a buzz about this show and really honored to be a guest.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate you being here because this is a subject of standardized testing that it's getting a lot of discussion, even though most of the conversation right now is around school choice and issues like that.
Yep.
Underpinning a lot of it is, how do we know how our kids are doing to know that we need a different schooling option, right?
Yep.
And we've relied on testing. People talk about the test scores, look at the scores of this school versus that school. And I'm seeing kind of 2 poles form. The standardized testing is not relevant anymore because it impedes equity. And on the other side, you might have it's not relevant anymore because the tests themselves are steering the educators in the schools towards presenting material that is, ideologically captured. So as a teacher myself, former classroom educator and homeschooling parent, I'm somewhere there going, I want tests. I want to know how kids are doing. And I know there are a lot of parents who share that view. What do you say about the general question? Do standardized tests, K through 12, have relevance? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, Deb, absolutely. Tests are important, and I think that you've done a great job articulating the problem, right? There is a crowd that wants to eliminate standardized testing, and I think the reason they want to eliminate it is because standardized testing is about the least PC tool you could ever create, right? They show us all kinds of things people don't really want to talk about, right? The reality is, for example, that students coming from homes where the parents went to college, homes with books, homes with married parents, those kids across the board, across demographics, do better on standardized tests, right? And I think part of the reaction and this is the analogy I like to use, Deb, when someone looks in the mirror, they can, and maybe they don't like what they see, there's kind of 1 or 2 responses, right? You could hit the gym and go work out and get in shape if you don't like what you see, or you could just blame the mirror and destroy the mirror, all right, and call the mirror racist, right, which is what we've seen with one camp with standardized tests, right? Congressman Bowman, shortly after George Floyd, stood on the floor of the House and said that standardized testing was a pillar of systematic racism in America. The other concern that you articulated, though, is also real, right? That these tests are pushing a bunch of bad ideas. Test drive curriculum. There's no escaping that. Test drive curriculum, right? And look, right now we're seeing NWEA maps, the test that is used widely, right? Even in Catholic schools, half of Catholic schools probably use NWEA maps testing, and they are pushing at the very fringe. I'm talking about, this is, if you go to the website right now, For kindergartners, read aloud. They're recommending the drag queen's dress goes swish, swish, swish. Read aloud for kindergartners. This is one of the main standardized tests being used in elementary schools right now. So, absolutely, these testing companies have gone kind of fanatical ideologically, and people are right. Not just conservatives. Any kind of normal centrist is right to say, I don't know that I agree that we should be reading the drag queen's dress goes swish, swish, swish to 5-year-olds. That seems pretty fringe and pretty radical. So your concerns are on point. They're accurate. They're valid. And CLT, we exist, I believe, to solve both of these.
Well, that's great. So right now, the CLT is geared towards high school, correct?
Well, right now the CLT is 7th through 12th grade, but
Seventh.
CLT 3, 4, 5, and 6 is being piloted this spring. It'll be standardized, our norm reference this coming summer, and then it'll be out. So schools can pilot it now, but it won't be standardized until this coming summer. But the reason we're doing this is so many schools have said, we're seeing what the standardized testing companies are doing. We're seeing what they are pushing ideologically, and we're not about it. And look, when we say that tests drive curriculum, I actually believe, Deb, this is one of the few things in education that almost every teacher actually agrees with. And we're not even saying it's a good thing or it's a bad thing. We're just saying it's a reality that the tests end up driving the curriculum. And if that is the case, then you need to have timeless, beautiful texts that have stood the test of time rather than, things that are trying to push a new, perspective at this given moment. So CLT students are reading Frederick Douglass. They're reading St. Augustine, George MacDonald, C.S. Lewis, texts that we believe are worthy of a student's time and attention.
That's fabulous. I think a concern amongst parents of elementary age students as well is that the tests are focusing too much on concepts and abstract thinking at a developmental age where the kids are really not prepared for it. And then they're not learning computation and math. They're not learning their proper reading skills. They're not learning grammar. They're not learning spelling. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm not even really sure what they're even putting on those early at third grade test because they're not teaching those things anymore. So I start to wonder if they're just testing them on having right ideas. I put in quotes
Yep.
because so many of these kids are not performing the way we parents would expect in terms of knowing their multiplication tables or being able to diagram a sentence or identify the noun in the sentence, at least something like that.
Sure. Yeah.
So what can we parents do to uh make sure our kids are learning or to influence the schools to teach the things the kids need to learn in the absence of a test that will do it?
It's a great question, and it's also a great concern as well. Over testing, I think, is a real problem, especially at the lower grades. And we always say we don't want to be another test. We want to be the right test. I think
Right.
when schools have to, take days, multiple days sometimes for standardized
Mhm.
testing to put their students in front of tests that are ultimately meaningless and joyless and kind of wonder killing. That is not okay. And you look at what they're actually reading. I mean, it really does. It's kind of soul sucking. It crushes wonder and curiosity out of students. So, and that's what we didn't start before third grade. Any kindergartner, first grader, second grader, they shouldn't be taking any kind of standardized test at all. They should be doing exceptionally long recess period. We've learned recently, and I just read a great book, Deb, called "The Coddling of the American Mind" that I would recommend to
Mhm.
your audience.
Yep.
They really focus the importance of recess and just unstructured play, right? And that basically, like, nothing parents can or teachers can manufacture can compete with what happens developmentally when students just go outside and kind of follow their nose and just explore the world, right? We've got to get back to that, I think.
I completely agree. I think that would improve so many things, including the big concern of mental health and all that, because
Yeah.
you really need, especially little kids, need to move and need to explore. Um, at the same time, though, we know that the learning they're going to do in a standardized setting, so in other words, a school, schools are standardized sort of by necessity
Mm.
because you're teaching a broad audience and you need to be able to report back to various, to the parents, if nobody else, that it's working, that, it's difficult for teachers. You can individualize and differentiate in a classroom to a greater degree than people imagine. But at the end of the year or at the end of the semester, whatever, you need some way to let the parents know little Johnny, little Susie, little whatever is doing fine. And the challenge parents have faced is they're being told your student is fine, your student is doing okay, only to discover after 3rd grade that that's not the case. So, they'll say they're doing fine, their MAPS test or something from 3rd grade said they're reading at grade level or they're whatever it says. And it's somewhat arcane trying to figure out what the tests mean, right? They've made it
Yeah.
almost impossible to understand. And then they have a 5th grader who's not doing well, frustrated, acting out in school, et cetera, and they finally drill down to figure out that the child is not reading proficiently, is not reading at 5th grade level, and probably wasn't reading at whatever 3rd grade level ought to have been.
Yeah.
So that seems to be like the missing piece in terms of evaluation of student performance and achievement. The MAPS test don't do it. People don't feel like they can count on the teachers. I've been telling parents, hand your child a book.
Mm.
I've
Yeah.
literally been saying, hand them a
Yeah.
book at this lexile level and have them read it to you. And if you have any doubts, then you go and do something because I just don't feel like we can count on the test right now. What do you think?
I think that's true. And what happens when students, when children read out loud with mom and dad, and it's even better than putting on an Audible or something. I mean, learning is inherently relational, right? And, even if you play an Audible for your kid, they may have the cool sound effects and the voices and whatnot, but hearing mom or dad read out loud to them, that it's irreplaceable. It's what we've been doing, for generations. And, I think, Deb, part of what you're getting at is I think, the larger, really what has changed in education in the past 100+ years, and essentially education really did not change much, from the time of, Aristotle and Plato's Republic for 2,000 years, and then really in the late 19th century, early 20th century, it starts to undergo rapid changes. And essentially now what we're doing is almost, it's something completely different, not kind of different. It is completely different than what we did for century after century after century. And education, before that, was very much, I would say, it was kind of craftsmanship, right? And education became part of kind of industrialization and mass production, right? And it does not work, right? Classical education, good education is never easy. It takes a ton of love. It takes a ton of energy, right? Any shortcut is going to, at the end of the day, the student is not going to be the same, right? A well-educated young person is someone who has been poured into by their parents, by great teachers. It takes love and it takes sacrifice, and I think we're finally now, maybe even as a nation, waking up to, that we have bought into this industrial factory model vision for schooling that is failing students.
What do you say to the people who want to reimagine education to include more technology? So, in other words, AI, crunching data that has been gathered from the students when surveys and or observations by teachers, and then they're spitting out these allegedly customized lessons based on what the
Yeah.
AI says and so on. And then, when I look at that side by side with a classical education, for example, to me, it's obvious that the classical is superior and actually more capable of being, customized and differentiated for the individual than this mechanized thing. But I'm running into opposition. People say you're a Luddite, you're afraid of the 21st century, you're backwards, or any number of insults. And I'm a struggle with that. How do you address and or kind of sell that type of great educate what you and I would call a great education, which sort of coincides with the classical version? How do we persuade people that that works for the modern era just as well as any other era?
That really great question, and I think again it helps to think about the historical context here, right? And so we essentially remove God from education, from the classroom in the 60s and 70s, and there's always going to be a filler, right? And so initially it's kind of open classrooms, it's anything new is kind of the filler, right? We begin to see a rapid decline with that, right? And then we get into the 90s, and we get into kind of the standards movement, right? And now what we're into is kind of the worship and the obsession with tech. I mean, really, I taught in the public school arena for 10 years, and it was like every new smart board, cool gadget was going to somehow like solve education. No, like if there's not substance, um, there's not substance, and any kind of gadget or smart board is not going to change that. And look, the language that the children are growing up in, the world they're growing up, the air they breathe is tech, is technology, right? It's a language. I mean, you're picking up on this if you've got a 2-year old and you're listening. They can just start swiping on a cell phone, right? It's amazing. You're like, how did you learn to screenshot something? I never taught you that. Who taught you that, right? It's a language. They're acquiring it in ways that are too subtle for it to even pick up on, right? We don't need to teach kids tech. The idea that we could teach kids tech is absurd, is laughable, right? They're going to be just fine navigating tech. What they need serious core knowledge, and what they need is moral formation, right? There is nothing more terrifying in a world with incredible technology than having that tech in the hands of people without any kind of ethical formation, without any kind of moral formation to stop and to question, should I do this? Should I not do this? How does this impact other people? Is this good for human flourishing? These are the questions that young people need to be exposed to, that they need to start asking rather than exposure to tech.
Oh, I could not agree more. And I think the trouble is explaining to people how ancient and or even just like recent history texts, the last century,
Yeah.
how that works. Again, sometimes when things are axiomatic to you because you lived it, it's difficult to explain to somebody else. It's like you said, it's like the air you breathe.
Yeah.
And I've been sort of grasping for the right language to use to translate, to explain to people that the reason we call them classics or the reason these things have stood the test of time is the themes are timeless, the ethics, the values
Yes.
are timeless. They can and should be used as your benchmark for these modern technological advances. Just because we can, should we? Well, wouldn't you rather evaluate it against something that's lasted for thousands of years than
Yes, and Deb, that is such a great point. And to use an analogy, my parents, my mom was a career French teacher in the public school arena. When I was in college, they moved to Lyon, France. And so I would use it as kind of a home base in summer, and would be out there for Christmas breaks in college. And you can't really have a perspective of America and American culture until you've spent some significant time in another country. And then you start to realize, okay, wow, like our relationship with food is really different. This whole suburbia thing, they don't actually really do that in other countries. This is uniquely American, right? Oh yeah, like football is totally an American thing. You get a whole new perspective because you have something else to compare it to, right? And that's what classical education does. You're so in the weeds of it. If you go to a modern kind of mainstream school K-12, that you can't have any perspective on the moment in time that you happen to be born into, because it's all you know, right? Whereas a serious classical education can actually give young people the ability to evaluate what's good and what's that bad and maybe toxic about the current moment.
I agree, and I've come into contact with some teens recently who have asked the question um about Judeo-Christian values as an example. They'll say, "Well, what if I don't believe in God and I'm not religious? What's the point of Judeo-Christian values? Why do I need to care about that?" And that actually scares me a little bit because I don't happen to think that you have to be a believer or you have to worship at a particular church or synagogue or something to value Judeo-Christian values. And it's if we are doing that poor a job of explaining the simple legal and political structure of the United States and its underpinnings and like how we are what we are and why that is fundamentally different, which to your point, you can only really have a perspective on if you've either lived abroad or at least read text from the histories of those countries, um, then we're really in danger because it's not some other thing that's just like, well, choice A or choice B. It's fundamental. It's
Hmm.
fundamental to the continued existence of the country in my view, and I think that goes well beyond whether you like I said, whether you go to church or you don't go to church or you're a believer. I think we once upon a time used to agree that that set of ethics, that set of values was the one we were following, that our founders followed, etcetera, and that is what permits people from other religions to come here and practice their religion freely and unhindered, right? As long as,
Yeah.
that's your freedom to do it. And we're just not getting that point across at all. We're not connecting the dots for these students, and I do blame the testing structure to a large degree. We were talking about which came first, the chicken or the egg, but I really think it's not that they're captured, it's that they're steering the ship.
Yes, that is so well said. Absolutely. And to take one example, I mean, the College Board, and Deb, I would describe the College Board as maybe the most powerful entity in American education. I mean, this is a company that's been around for almost 100 years, more than 100 years. They launched in
Yeah.
1900. They own the SAT, they own the PSAT, they own the AP test and the AP curriculum and the AccuPlacer, on and on and on. And you look at the way that a school is, the way they treat AP as their proud courses of academic excellence, right?
Mhm.
And we've seen this in Florida. We're seeing this in other places. We've seen this in the AP US and AP Euro for a long time. They are pushing a version of history that minimizes the great contributions of Western civilization and especially Christianity and the church to mankind. Students are graduating with a very warped view of history, and the College Board, is in many ways the source of this.
Yeah, absolutely, and they really do have a warped view. They're not getting I mean, I'm not a big both sideser because
Yeah.
I wear my bias on my sleeve. I don't think there are 2 sides to the story. It's like there's actual history and there's actual history. There's not the let's tell 1619 and the other no, I don't think so. Not certainly not in a school. Now, if you want to go read the New York Times magazine, it's a free country. Do what you want, but I think when we are teaching young people, we need to be as close to neutral is not the right word. I think it's okay to have an agenda, but the agenda should at least support the country in which the students live for its continued existence as a country and a functioning one at that. That's not to say that everything we do is perfect. That's not to say that it should push a specific point of view on policy, and in fact, it currently does, which is a
Mm.
problem. But it should, I would think, at least uphold the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the fundamental documents that you know, shape our, electoral process. And it's
Yeah.
not doing that. And your comment about AP history, I tutor, and I've had several students come to me for tutoring with that. And I, I've almost had to quit.
Mm.
I've almost had to say, I can't in clear conscience do this because I'm now having to tutor you or help you learn something that I think is fundamentally incorrect and or harmful. And now we're seeing with African American studies in Florida, as you mentioned. It's not African American studies even.
Mm.
It's 100% a left wing fringe narrative about intersectionality,
You
critical
know,
theory, and all that.
I mean, Deb, yeah. I mean, let's talk about that for a minute. The central to the black story in America, central is blacks in slavery,
Mhm.
identifying with Old Testament Israel, right? That is
100%.
how they identified. And that story, I guarantee you, it's not part of the story. It's a main component of the story. It is
Mhm.
going to be completely missed in this College Board course, right? And because the students they don't have any basic knowledge of the Old Testament at all anyway, it wouldn't mean anything if they had to. So this is really, it's miseducation is what it is.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because that's when they bring up, what do you even mean by Judeo-Christian values, or they'll say, isn't that a right-wing talking point? They don't even understand what you just said. That's central to the history of Black Americans is Old Testament narrative, the Old
Yeah.
Testament stories. This, and in terms of the abolition movement, in terms of everything that they genuinely care about. I mean, if you talk to young people today, they genuinely care about equality. They genuinely care
Mm.
about, protecting minorities, but they're being given such a skewed story about how that has happened, how that
Yeah.
there has been tremendous progress, and who was behind it
Yeah.
and what was behind it, which, to your point, is, the Bible, people who believed in the Bible, people who saw it as their absolute mission in life to free the slaves.
Yeah.
And these were not secularists.
Oh no,
So
Deb, a book that came out last summer called "The Black Intellectual Tradition." It was co-authored by one woman who is the president of the CLT Board of Academic Advisors. She's a professor at the University of Virginia, one of America's leading Black intellectuals, and this is an intellectual tradition that is a rich tradition that was cultivated and grew during these years of slavery and Jim Crow and oppression, but you fundamentally cannot understand it. You can't understand the tradition of Black spirituals, the hymns that were created during this time, if you don't have, that part of the story, that central part of the story of Blacks again identifying as Israel enslaved to the Egyptians. College Board isn't going to tell that story.
no. And it's different from, for example, the people who say, "Oh, well, it doesn't that support the narrative of the Black Hebrew Israelites?" And you're like, No. And then the other argument is, well, all that does, if we teach that, that's just teaching colonialism. That's just teaching that their native religions were, pushed out of them and they were forced to be Christian and so on. And first of all, I don't know that that's necessarily true, that they were forced to be Christian. They weren't taught to read. So I don't know who's forcing you to be Christian if they don't let you read the Bible. But regardless, I'm not certainly an expert on that. I just know that however it happened initially, there was a lot of choice involved in continuing it
Yeah.
and perpetuating it and adding to it, like you mentioned, the spirituals and so forth. And this is not being taught. And so when we talk about teaching a true history, the true history isn't being taught. It's not.
Yeah.
And I do think the College Board is a big part of that. I do think that this also steers teacher education. What's your take on teacher education vis-a-vis standardized testing? Because there are a fair amount of teachers who oppose standardized
Yeah.
testing now.
Yeah, I mean, there. Look, at the end of the day, there's basically four levers, Deb, as I can understand it. They kind of end up controlling education, right? And the four levers are: one, standardized testing, because the tests end up driving the curriculum, they drive the academic focus. So standardized testing. The others are going to be teacher certification, right? Teacher certification is huge, right? And if you have to basically ingest, the modern progressive understanding of children, of teaching, in order to be certified, right? And that is right now. I mean, the reality is that to be certified as a teacher, I mean, think about it this way, Deb. For the top classical schools that I know, many of them view teacher certification as a liability to hiring teachers, right? Because what does it signal if the teacher is state certified? It signals that they've ingested bad ideas about pedagogy, about teaching, about children, and so this is a crisis. This is at the heart of the crisis, is teacher certification for sure. Then you also have school accreditation, right? And this is why the Department of Education should not exist, right? Is because fundamentally the way that our founders understood education, it is fundamentally moral. It is about the shaping of virtue. You cannot separate education from religion at the end of the day, right? It is about imparting a worldview, a sense of what is good, of what is evil, right? You can't separate these things. The Department of Education should not exist. And so now we have an accreditation system that they are and this is happening very, very rapidly. They are piling on the kind of the new progressive orthodoxy in order to remain accredited for schools, right? And hopefully, if there is a DeSantis administration or something coming up, accreditation can get broken. But this is really, one of the major, I think, strangleholds on education right now. So, and then the other one, of course, is funds. And so, school choice opens up the free market. A free market solves so many problems. Things that are not worth their salt die, and things that are really good flourish and thrive. Competition, everybody wins, right? Except the schools that are not offering anything that anybody wants anyway, right? And so, we're seeing all four of these again. Standardized testing, accreditation, school choice, and teacher certification. I'm optimistic, Deb. 3 or 4 years, it's going to be a very, very different looking picture than it is right now.
Well, I certainly hope you're correct. I do have a question though about the school choice piece and well, funding specifically. I don't think any of us is opposed to
Yeah.
parents directing their children's education. And when I say any of us, I mean, 90% of parents I talk to who are not just all in on public school and, all people who agree with us that the schools are not doing well would love to have more choices for parents. But many of us, myself included, are concerned that the word choice, as opposed to liberty, right, still implies that someone's giving the choices. Someone is determining or itemizing what your options are. And the way that this is currently structured, it leaves government in the position of decider.
Yep.
So the same government that's deciding how teachers in your state should be certified or if they should be certified, the same government that says, here's what you have to do to get funding from the federal government, from the state government. Here are the rules you have to follow. Here are the regulations you have to follow, et cetera. And we're not just talking about safety and fire code. We're talking about things right down into the curriculum. So as long as the money is originating from the same pot, run
Sure.
by the
Yeah.
same political actors, there are a lot of us who are concerned that we need to have more and more robust conversations about these pillars that you just talked about and making changes to those at the same time, because otherwise all we're doing is moving the money around. So, in other words, the same value structure, the same political pressures that are causing the schools today, private schools included to a large degree, to lean into the sort of woke ideas or the anti-American ideas they're not going anywhere. They're very well funded, they're very well organized. And when this money is now, you can take the same money but originating from the same pot to the other private actors, is it really a free market, or is it just opening the door for the government to come into private spaces and potentially, I'm not saying it's automatic. A lot of people have accused me of saying it's an automatic thing. No, of course not. The
Yeah.
schools can decide we don't want to take that money. Parents can have some say in it, but the pressure will start to be felt by the private schools to be accredited, to hire either unionized teachers or certified teachers to keep that money flowing, or it will become part of these campaign slogans of your tax dollars are going here and you need this and that to be,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah.
That's a concern that I have, that I don't want to derail school
Totally.
choice.
Totally. Yeah.
Of course not. But I definitely want to protect individual rights, parents' rights, and I want to
Mhm.
protect the independent schools. I want the schools to stay independent.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it is a real concern, and it is a really thoughtful concern. And it is interesting. On the one hand, you end up with some of the people I've talked to who are really against school choice. It's kind of weird bedfellows of like you have diehard public school who love the union. They always will give the public schools the benefit of the doubt,
Right.
and then also sometimes with some folks in the homeschool arena, or some kind of the most conservative, who are concerned about exactly what you articulated so well.
Yeah.
Well, okay, who then gets to define what is and isn't a school, right? It
Right.
may sound really good, but if at the end of the day, the Department of Ed, which shouldn't exist, is still in the seat of defining who is and who isn't a school, then we're all just beholden to the political whims and whoever happens to be the administration at the time. So that is concern. So what do you do? Well, I think you solve the problem by returning it to the local level, right?
Mm.
I am optimistic. Maybe it sounds like a pipe dream, but the Department of Ed has to go. The Department of Ed goes, and then what happens next is that this returns to a state level, right? And at the state level, you're not going to get the same kind of when you actually know the people, things change, right? And so the more that we can return, and this is actually something that people on the progressive left and a lot of conservatives agree on, right? The idea that education is fundamentally a local matter, and that what happens with federal intrusion is that it crowds out local ownership, local involvement, and so that's what needs to happen. It's a real concern that if we have school choice, with the DOE being the only entity that can say what is and isn't a school, that could be a scary scenario. But we can get around that potentially by eventually, hopefully, getting rid of the DOE altogether.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I just think we definitely need to keep the conversation going. And what I would implore my listeners, viewers to do is um in your zeal to have more options, in your desperation to have more options, stay keep the pressure on lawmakers and policymakers to increase your
Yeah,
freedom, to keep independent schools independent, and to keep you, the parents, in the driver's seat rather than just give you dollars. Like, dollars are a start for sure, but to
hmm
fulfill on the promise of incremental change and the promise of a free market solution, you have to actually have a goal, right? A destination you want to get to that says, our ideal is the DOE doesn't exist anymore. Our ideal is we want to, change teacher certification. We want to change standardized testing. We want to, we want everyone doing the classic learning test,
yeah,
whatever your ultimate goal is. That's your destination that you're trying to move towards, because for sure, the people who've been moving it in a progressive direction, they know where they want to go.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it is in the sense of that, there is no limiting principle for them. So
Hmm.
it's just more money, less transparency, let's keep going. And if we're not moving the ball down our end of the field, we can't expect to really score a
Well,
real
and
win.
Deb,
So
this is one of the reasons I was really excited to come on your show. I really believe, every conservative needs to rally around classical education, because classical education is not a niche movement. It's not a little
mm-mm.
sideshow for people who like old books and poetry and that sort of thing. Classical education is education as it always was before. Essentially, it was hijacked by
Yes.
I think really fringe, not the center left, but very fringe progressives beginning in the 20th century, and very intentionally hijacked as well. Classical education is a return to the kind of education that 100% of America's founders had, right? This is what we need to get back to. And like, you think about the connection to classical education in our founding documents. Our founders built a system of checks and balances because they understood accurately human nature, right? Without their view of human nature, there is no checks and balances. That's the secret sauce that has made this the greatest system of government in the history of the world. They couldn't have created this system of government without a classical education. This is a timeless education that teaches the most profound truths about what it means to be human. And we've got to unite around this. A lot of conservatives are thinking that, okay, we're just going to remove all the gender ideology and remove the CRT from the schools and everything will be fine. No, everything will not be fine, right? That is a band-aid solution. What we need to do is re-embrace classical.
I completely agree. And I wish people understood that what the progressive movement did with the Prussian model and the sort of industrial school model, it was, well, not only inherently racist to a large degree and xenophobic against Catholics, against, people coming from languages, countries with languages nobody spoke here, as far as they didn't speak English. But it was also to prevent them from getting a classical education. In other words, classical education only then became a thing for the elite.
Yeah,
Elite were still getting classically educated, and the only people who couldn't were those shuffled into those public schools. And what we're trying to do, actually, you and I and others are trying to open it up. I mean, the true, freedom of,
yeah,
like, the same education that, George Washington or Ben Franklin or Thomas Jefferson had should be available to all children. We believe all children can learn these things. You don't need to be born with a silver spoon in your mouth to learn to
mm,
read the classics. And one of my favorite educators is Marva Collins. I'm sure you're familiar with Marva Collins,
sure,
but
yeah,
she took students in Chicago that were sort of what they called the throwaway children, And she taught them a classical education. She had them reading Aristotle and Plato and, Shakespeare and all these things. And these are kids who were just, they're not going to learn anything. And
Mm.
there they were a year later, and in a classical curriculum, reading and doing math better than the kids, their counterparts in the public schools. So
Yeah.
it is a lie that you have to be a certain kind of person to do well in a classical setting or with classical material. Is just not true. Now, I will ask you a question though that put you, you know, sort of devil's advocate here.
Mm.
Do you? What about those students who really, or parents who think their children should have much more leeway in what they learn, not really completely unschooling, but the classical structure is too structured and it won't work for their kids, and we're just barking up the wrong tree. We need to have a free range kind of option. What do you think about that?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. One of the things, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, they disagreed on a number of things. But one of the things they really, really agreed on was that the future of America was dependent on the education of the electorate, right? And that in a self-governing society, every citizen has to have a serious education, right? Deb, I talk about this a lot because it was shocking for me. I saw this probably 5 or 6 years ago. NBC did their own poll our study on what percent of Americans could actually pass the U.S. citizenship test. And they discovered that it was only about a third of Americans could pass. But this is what was really, really interesting in that. What they actually discovered was that for Americans under 65, they did great. 74% of them can pass the U.S. citizenship test. But for under 45, the same demographic that also has the most formal education, only 19% of them can pass the U.S. citizenship test, right? So not only do we not understand, the deeper things, how the founders understood human nature and built that into a system of checks and balances, not only do we not understand that, we don't even understand how the government is supposed to work. And by we, I mean collectively America right now, right? And this is a failure of education. And it's such a failure that we have seen this is what has led to the civic discord, strife that we have experienced as a nation. So, yeah, I think a lot of folks right now, and I hear this on the political right as well a lot, right? My kid, he wants to be an HVAC person, and shouldn't have to go and read these books and learn these things. And I personally couldn't disagree more, right? America, I mean, we are a society that is built around self-government, and self-government requires an educated electorate.
I agree. And I don't think that certainly your K-12 education should dictate what you do for a living. And I don't believe in this college and career readiness nonsense. I think a well-educated person can chart their own course no matter where they want to go, no matter what they want to do. And this is where I do depart from even some in the homeschooling community who think it should be, just the student led, whatever the student's curious about, whatever they want to learn. And
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that's an automatic fail. Okay. I'm just saying that I think, to your point, if you believe in America, like what
Mm.
we are and how we're structured, self-governance, I think that's a great way
Yeah.
to put it. If you believe in the power of self-governance, individual liberty, and that your child should grow up and have that political freedom and pass it on to their children and so on and so forth, then you're leaving a lot up to chance. You're leaving a lot up to chance if you don't have steer that ship a little bit. If you don't at least expose them to these things and make sure there's a core curriculum involved that will permit them to participate in that. There's not a uh, there's not a curriculum that you could follow that doesn't contain that's going to result in your child being able to defend their own liberty, in my personal opinion. Now, I'm sure that people
Yeah.
disagree with me, but that's just my take on it. Can you explain to people, though, how it is? I think they have a vision of classical education as rows of desks. It's very boring. The teacher lectures at you and stands at the front of the room, and you must know this and pass a test. I think they're confusing elements of the industrial Prussian model
Sure.
with classical, and they can't picture how it works. Can you help them understand?
Absolutely. One of the great joys of CLT Dev has been touring schools, colleges and secondary schools, elementary schools, even, and honestly, I think about the school that I was most impressed with. It's called the St. Constantine School in Houston, Texas. They're as classical as you get, right? what are their children doing, especially K3, right? Their first, second, third graders, kindergartners. They went, I think, actually like 3 or 4x on recess. The kids are outside for a couple hours a day, built, playing with animals, and they have an amazing garden, right? They double down on art, right? Classical education is fundamentally about cultivating wonder. It is born out of wonder. The greatest crime, I believe, of the factory model is that it has crushed curiosity and wonder out of so many millions, right, of children. And fundamentally, that is what classical education gets right. If it's doing classical education well, is that it is rooted in curiosity, in wonder with the natural world. I hear about amazing things happening, from stargazing and camping, the Charlotte Mason model of reconnecting with nature. You can do this in many ways. It's not to bash if there is there are plenty of classical schools where students do spend time in rows of desks. But when I visit schools, typically, especially at the high school level, I typically see students around a big table together. Often it'll be a single book. Maybe they have, the Iliad in their hands and nothing else. And they're talking about the things that really matter.
I think too, if people become familiar with the trivium, then they would understand how developmentally appropriate the the modalities are. So in other
Yeah.
words, like what you just said about the littler kids and they have lots of recess and they're in a grammar phase.
Yeah.
They're in a stage of learning that is just going to be fundamentally different from their logic stage and then from their rhetoric, and this does coincide much more closely with what we have learned about brain
Mm.
science, about child development, than anything the progressives are doing right now. The progressives have thrown all child
Yeah.
development out the window. So if you really want to think about what is actually more scientifically sound, what is more free in terms of supporting your child's natural curiosity, wonder, growth stages, more
Yeah.
but permits their personal expression, all these things. Classical actually does align. I think people just have this image of it. They hear the word classical and they think dry and boring, and
Yeah.
they don't really know what it actually is.
Yeah, Deb, I love you brought that up. I mean, now that we have, all of these insights into cognitive development, what we're actually seeing is like, wow, the ancients were right. They understood something that like 2,000 years later, we're able to actually visibly view cognitively as the brain develops. So yeah, absolutely. And there's, at the end of the day, there's nobody or no organization, CLT or any other, to define, right, who is and who is not exactly doing classical
Right.
right. I think what we are seeing right now is a renaissance of a return to tradition, return to the great books, a return to things like penmanship, memorization, not memorizing answers for a standardized test, but memorizing great works of poetry, right? Memorizing hymns. We're seeing really, really a flowering, a rediscovery of what I think we came very close to losing.
Well, I hope it continues. So I want to ask you just a couple more questions before we close out that are sort of on the action oriented side. We've talked a lot about what is and what your beliefs and values and so forth are, but from an action standpoint, what do you recommend that parents do to keep, to keep the pressure on as far as uh, standardized testing that is going to be helpful for their students? In other words, I'm assuming that you don't agree with those who say throw
Mm.
standardized tests out the window. We don't need them anymore at all. So just from
Yeah.
the, if I'm wrong, correct me, but if I'm right, what do you think parents should do outside the schools, if they don't want to trust what the school tests are doing, because the kids have to sit for those tests. There's nothing you can really do about it. But if they want for their own peace of mind, is there something you recommend? What do
Yeah.
you think they should be pressuring their lawmakers about, that sort of thing on the standardized test side?
Yeah, Deb, it's gonna be very hard for me to not give an extremely biased answer. I mean, my life's work, of course, is the classic learning test, and so yeah, students' parents use it as a college entrance exam, but it's so much more than that. And many homeschool families, but not just homeschool, public school as well, private school, they use the CLT as well as an internal metric. And one of the things that it's going to do is it's going to give you a sense, and it's just a snapshot, right? Sometimes people try to make a standardized test into so much more than it should be. It's a helpful snapshot into where a student is at in some key academic areas at a given moment in time. And to try to make it anything more than that, I think is really unhelpful as well. But what CLT is going to do is show a parent, okay, on a nationally normed group of students, how does my son or daughter do reading America's founding documents? How do they do reading great religious texts or great works of philosophy? How do they do with logic and analytical reasoning? So what we're able to do on CLT analytics, I think, is very exciting for parents to really, really have a good sense of where their students are at right now. So I would recommend it for that. And look, I think there should be others as well. I think CLT is right now in a very unique place as we're kind of really the only educationally conservative standardized testing company that is out there. I mean, the rest are either center left, but most of them are aggressively, as I said, with MAPS pushing kind of the new progressive orthodoxy that we just came into being about 5 years ago.
And in terms of their, if they want to keep pressure on their, legislators, or because it's my understanding that standardized tests are decided. I mean, the state decides what the schools will use, right? And then the federal government too, right? They have to take tests and send the results to the
Yeah.
federal government. So, I mean, when they're dealing with, people running for office and so on, what should parent groups be saying or demanding about the way that tests, because these tests are, we just discussed, steering the curriculum. And as you pointed out, it's not just about get rid of drag queen story hour. We need to get
Yeah.
back to teaching math and reading and all these things. But if the tests are steering in this direction, then it seems like parent organizations needs to put pressure for that too. Fix the tests.
Yeah, and ultimately this does become a legislative issue, and I believe 16 or 17 states right now have already made moves to adopt CLT, and so in terms of satisfying the requirements for what private schools can use or public schools or homeschool students to satisfy state standards. So we've been at and honestly, Deb, for many of those states, the way we got on there, CLT doesn't do what the College Board does or ACT or Pearson. What they do is they hire a whole army of lobbyists to go wine and dine local, politicians to get legislation passed that forces kids to take their test. That is how the College Board does business, right? And so for many students, even though many colleges have gone test optional, the College Board is contracting directly with the state of Illinois for, I believe, $65 million, right? And what they're doing during that as well is they're data mining every student in the state, and they're selling all of that information to all of the big public universities as well. This is what the College Board is up to, and they do this because look, the free market has kind of spat. The free market has rejected the College Board. The free market has rejected the ACT, and so because of that, they have used the heavy hand of the state to say you're going to have to take the test if you like it or not at your school. It's a graduation requirement or it's an end of grade requirement. So there is a legislative component. And yeah, overall right now, it is generally red states like North Carolina, Virginia, Florida, Texas, where CLT already is getting a lot of love.
I'm so glad you brought that up. A lot of parents don't realize that schools are now making it a graduation requirement
Yeah.
to take and pass by some standard, the SAT, the ACT, one or the other, and that this is being done with our tax dollars
Yep.
just to keep the College Board in business to a large degree because people have, rejected them. And
Mm-hmm.
then that, of course, steers the teaching.
Yeah.
And when you couple that with the fact that there is pressure put on schools and teachers to allow anyone to take AP classes. It used to be you had to be recommended, you had to have a certain grade point average, and these courses were tough because you were going for, to pass a test and to get college credit. Nowadays, I advise students not to do AP and to take community
Mm.
college classes for dual enrollment because at least you definitely get the credit and
Yeah.
it's free because you've already paid through your taxes. So I'm making different recommendations to parents because of all the shenanigans
Mm.
that have gone on that have taken the prestige as well as the likelihood that you'll earn the college credit in the first place away from the AP.
Yeah.
They're using it politically. So I'm really glad you brought that up. And then finally, when parents want to pursue classical education for their children, but have not done it yet. So their student is in 5th grade or their student is in 8th grade or there's in other words,
Mm.
they've not followed the trivium at all. They've been
Yeah.
in progressive school all this time and they're very dissatisfied, but their child is already in the, like this mode, or they've been on their, Google Chromebook, whatever, for all eternity. And yet they hear you speak or they watch some of my videos and they think, that's what I want for my
Mm.
child. I want this. What do you recommend to them to make that transition and to go through the process to find a school where their child's not going to feel like thrown into the deep end, or what can they do?
Yeah, and I think part of this question, Deb, we've got to address, the question of how do you pay for this as well? A lot of
That
parents hear about
that
hear about
too.
this, and they're like, okay, hey, look, these schools are springing up all over the place. There were probably 100 or more that launched just last year. There's going to be at least 100 more that launch in August, right? Mike, my kiddos, one of my kids, one of my six, goes to Divine Mercy Academy in Severna Park. It's a classical school in the Catholic tradition. But what I've learned, from that is for a lot of these schools that are launching, they want to work alongside of families where they're at. These are schools that are being founded by visionaries who want this typically for their own kids. It's why they're doing it. And so to say, hey, we can't afford to pay, full tuition here, but, what we could do is, we can help out with, X, Y, and Z or something like that. More often than not, that's the greater need for so many of these schools. So the first step is like, just go tour your local classical charter, your local classical Christian school. Just take a tour. That's the very first step. And typically when families do that, more often than not, they're going to make the transition within a couple of years.
Do you think there's a way for or a classical school for Jewish kids? Like, is
Oh,
there
absolutely.
like,
Absolutely. Yeah.
how what would that are there those? Does that
Yeah.
exist? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, there already is. There's a renaissance of classical education that's not only happening in the Jewish community, as well. Actually, one of the rapidly growing college in California, Zaytuna, is actually a Muslim great books liberal arts college as well. So I think this return to tradition, the desire for roots in a modern world that is so cut off and is kind of just floating without any kind of substance to be connected to. We're seeing this return in all kinds of ways. I'm a Christian. I love classical Christian education, and I'm a Catholic. So we in particular support Catholic classical schools, but it's across the board. We're seeing this in homeschooling and even across demographics. Something we haven't talked about a whole lot yet on this show, but sometimes there's this misperception out there that it's white affluent families to get to homeschool. Right now, the demographic that is leading for homeschools is Black families in America. 16% are homeschooling, and
Mhm.
the greatest achievement gap is between Black homeschooling families or students and Black public school students. On reading tests alone, we're talking about a gap of over 40% in terms of reading comprehension. So the secret is out. Our mainstream schools have failed at least a generation, and we're at the beginning of what I think is going to be a really, really beautiful and exciting time of renewal.
Well, that's such a wonderful note to finish on. An upbeat, positive note. Jeremy, I cannot thank you enough. This has been so helpful. I know that people watching and listening to this broadcast are going to be excited about, pursuing classical education for their kids or possibly helping out. I talk to people who are former teachers or even retired who are trying to
Hmm.
find ways to help. And I keep saying, look for a classical school, see if you can find a way to help out, even as a volunteer in this
Yeah.
environment, and it will give you a lot of hope. Certainly when I see your Twitter posts about your visits to schools, it does boost my mood. And I hope that this does take off. I hope we're seeing a renaissance of classical education in America, because I believe it is best. I'm biased,
Hmm.
and I believe it is the most supportive of self-governance. Just do. So
Amen. Deb, thanks for the invite, and thanks again for the work that you're doing. I mean, you
thank
really
you.
are, galvanizing the national conversation. So thank you, and happy to come back on the program anytime.
Anytime. For those who would like to reach Jeremy, you can reach him on Twitter at this address. And please also check out the podcast, it's Anchored, right? Anchored
Yep.
podcast. Available wherever you get your podcasts. I listen to it. It's bookmarked in my library. You should definitely check it out. You will learn a lot. And with that, I will say thank you to everyone for listening and for watching, and we'll see you next time.